In September of 490 BC, on a dusty coastal plain 26 miles from Athens, roughly 10,000 Greek soldiers stood in a line facing an invasion force that outnumbered them by a wide margin. Sent by the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, there was no expectation of rescue. Sparta, the most feared military power in Greece, had already said no, not out of cowardice, but because of a religious festival Spartan law forbade them from breaking, even for a battle that might decide whether Greek independence survived at all. What happened next on that plain didn't just save Athens. It became one of the most mythologized events in Western history, generating a legend about a dying runner that most people believe is fact, and obscuring a far more brutal, far more tactically fascinating reality underneath it. This is the real story of the Battle of Marathon. What actually happened, why it mattered, and where the myth and the history split apart. If deep historical breakdowns like this are what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Let's start with why Persia was coming for Athens in the first place. By 490 BC, the Persian Empire under King Darius I controlled more territory than any state in recorded history up to that point, stretching from the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan to the shores of the Aegean Sea, ruling over dozens of subject peoples through an administrative system considered remarkably sophisticated for its time. Persia wasn't looking at Greece as some existential rival. Greece, from Susa or Persepolis, looked like a fractious, disorganized collection of small city-states that mostly mattered as a source of occasional irritation. That irritation had a specific recent cause. In 499 BC, Greek cities in Ionia, on the western coast of modern Turkey, under Persian rule, had risen in revolt against Persian authority. Athens, along with the city of Eretria, sent a modest force to support the rebellion, and Athenian troops participated in an attack that resulted in the burning of Sardis, an important regional Persian capital. The revolt itself was ultimately crushed by Persian forces after several years of fighting, but Darius, according to Herodotus, did not forget who had helped burn one of his cities. Herodotus records a story, whether literally true or symbolically true, that Darius ordered a servant to repeat to him 3 times at every meal, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether or not that specific detail is precise, the underlying motivation is not seriously disputed by historians. Darius wanted to punish Athens and Eretria for their role in the Ionian Revolt, and more broadly, wanted to extend Persian control into mainland Greece, removing a persistent source of instability along the empire's western frontier. In 492 BC, Darius sent an initial expedition under his son-in-law Mardonius, which successfully subdued Thrace and Macedon but was badly damaged when its supporting fleet was wrecked in a storm rounding Mount Athos, a disaster that would later prompt the Persians to dig an entire canal through the peninsula years later, rather than risk those waters again. In 490 BC, Darius tried again, this time with a more direct approach. A force transported by sea aimed specifically at Eretria and Athens, commanded by 2 experienced generals, Datis and Artaphernes. Modern historians estimate this invasion force at somewhere between 20 and 25,000 infantry, along with cavalry, transported across the Aegean by a fleet of roughly 600 ships. Ancient sources give higher and less reliable figures, but the scale, by Greek standards, was overwhelming regardless of the exact count. The Persian fleet moved efficiently through the Aegean, subduing the island of Naxos, then landing at Eretria, on the island of Euboea. After a short siege, the city fell. Some accounts suggest through betrayal from within, and was burned, its population deported into the Persian Empire as captives, a fate meant to serve as an unmistakable warning to Athens about what resistance would cost. With Eretria dealt with, the Persian fleet crossed the narrow strait separating Euboea from the Greek mainland and landed at a plain called Marathon, roughly 26 miles northeast of Athens. The location wasn't random. Marathon offered good beaches for landing a large invasion force and open terrain suited to Persian cavalry, exactly the kind of ground the Greeks, fighting primarily as heavily armored infantry, would normally want to avoid. News of the Persian landing reached Athens quickly, and the city faced a genuinely desperate strategic situation. Athens' entire available military force, roughly 9,000 to 10,000 hoplites, heavily armored citizen soldiers who fought in tight, disciplined formations called phalanxes, was essentially all Athens had to work with. There was no professional standing army in the modern sense. These were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who trained periodically and owned their own armor, called up now to defend their entire way of life in a single engagement. Athens sent its fastest long-distance runner, a professional courier named Phidippides, to Sparta, a journey of roughly 150 miles across difficult terrain, to plead for military assistance. According to Herodotus, our earliest and most reliable source for this campaign, Phidippides made the trip in approximately 2 days, an extraordinary feat of physical endurance that modern ultramarathon runners still study and, in some cases, attempt to replicate as a tribute. This is worth pausing on, because it's the real athletic legend buried underneath the more famous, less accurate one you'll hear about later in this video. The Spartans, according to Herodotus, received Phidippides sympathetically and agreed, in principle, to help. But there was a problem. Spartan religious law required that no military campaign begin before the full moon during the sacred Carnea festival, which was still several days away. Sparta wasn't refusing out of indifference or cowardice. This was one of the most rigid, seriously observed religious obligations in Spartan society, and breaking it was not something Spartan authorities were willing to risk, even for a battle that might determine the fate of Greek independence. They promised to march as soon as the religious restriction lifted. Athens understood correctly that this meant no Spartan help was coming in time for the actual battle. One ally did answer the call. The small neighboring city of Plataea sent, essentially, its entire available fighting force. Accounts suggest somewhere around 1,000 hoplites to stand with Athens. It's worth noting how significant this was. Plataea had no obligation to risk near-total military exposure for Athens' fight, and doing so left their own city dangerously undefended. It's one of the more genuinely selfless acts of the entire ancient Greek world, and it tends to get a fraction of the attention the Spartans receive in popular retellings of Greek history, largely because Sparta's reputation looms so much larger in modern imagination. Athens' military leadership was structured as a board of 10 generals, called strategoi, one elected from each of the city's political tribes, operating alongside the war archon, a political military official named Callimachus, who held the deciding vote in the event the generals were split. Among the 10 generals was a man named Miltiades, who would emerge as the campaign's most consequential strategic mind, and whose personal history with Persia was more complicated and more useful than almost anyone else's on the Greek side. Miltiades had, for years before this campaign, served as a Greek ruler of the Thracian Chersonese under nominal Persian authority, giving him direct, first-hand experience with Persian military organization, tactics, and command structure that no other Athenian general possessed. He had, in fact, previously participated in a Persian military campaign under Darius himself, years earlier, before eventually fleeing Persian territory and returning to Athens as Persian pressure on the region increased. This background made him deeply useful and, to some of his political rivals, deeply suspect. Accusations of split loyalty followed him for years, an irony given how central his Persian expertise proved to be in the battle that would soon secure his place in history. The Athenian and Plataean force marched to Marathon and took up a defensive position blocking the roads leading toward Athens, but for several days, according to Herodotus's account, no battle actually occurred. Both sides held their positions, watching each other across the plain. The reasons for this standoff involve genuine historical uncertainty that's worth being honest about rather than glossing over. The Athenian generals, according to Herodotus, were themselves divided on strategy, with the board split roughly evenly between those who favored an immediate attack and those who preferred to wait for the promised Spartan reinforcements, however delayed. Callimachus, holding the tie-breaking vote, was persuaded by Miltiades to side with those favoring engagement rather than waiting, a decision Herodotus frames as pivotal to everything that followed. There's also a more practical strategic consideration modern historians point to: the Persian cavalry. Persian cavalry forces, mounted archers and lancers in particular, represented a serious threat to Greek hoplites on open ground, where cavalry could exploit gaps in formation or strike vulnerable flanks that infantry alone struggled to defend. Some ancient sources and a number of modern historians suggest that the Greek attack, when it finally came, was specifically timed to catch the Persian force at a moment when much or all of the cavalry was not present on the battlefield, potentially having been loaded back onto ships or engaged elsewhere for reasons that remain genuinely debated among historians rather than definitively established. This detail matters enormously for understanding what happened next, even though we can't state with total certainty exactly why the cavalry wasn't decisively present. Whatever the precise trigger, at some point after this standoff, the Greek force made the decision to attack. And what Miltiades did with the formation of that attacking army represents one of the more genuinely clever pieces of ancient battlefield tactics that we have detailed evidence for. Standard Greek hoplite tactics called for a phalanx of relatively even depth across its entire line, a solid wall of overlapping shields and leveled spears, typically arranged 8 men deep, designed to advance as a single, disciplined mass and overwhelm an enemy through weight and cohesion rather than individual maneuver. Miltiades broke from that standard approach in a specific and consequential way. Facing a Persian force with a wider battle line than his own limited numbers could match evenly across its full length, he thinned the center of the Greek formation, reducing it to perhaps 4 ranks deep, while significantly reinforcing both wings, stacking them considerably deeper than the weakened center. This wasn't a random adjustment. It was a deliberate acceptance of risk in one part of the battlefield in exchange for overwhelming strength in 2 others. When the Greek line advanced, according to Herodotus, they covered the final stretch of open ground at a run, a detail ancient military historians have long debated, since running in full hoplite armor, carrying a shield weighing roughly 15 to 20 pounds along with spear, helmet, and body armor is a genuinely exhausting proposition. The most commonly accepted modern interpretation is that the run began at a distance close enough to minimize exposure to Persian archery fire, while covering open ground where Persian cavalry, if present in force, could otherwise have inflicted serious damage on a slower-moving formation. The battle that followed unfolded largely as Miltiades appears to have anticipated, though not without real danger to the Greek side. In the center, where the Greek line was thinnest, Persian and Saka forces, Darius's most experienced infantry, positioned in the Persian center according to Herodotus, broke through and pushed the weakened Athenian and Plataean center backward, in some places into genuine retreat. But on both wings, where Miltiades had concentrated his depth and strength, the story was reversed entirely. The reinforced Greek flanks overwhelmed the lighter-armed Persian and allied troops facing them there, driving them back toward the sea in disorganized retreat. This is the moment that decided the entire battle, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Rather than pursuing their broken opponents on the wings in a disorganized chase, which would have been the easy, satisfying, and catastrophically wrong choice, the Greek commanders on both flanks pivoted their now victorious formations inward, wheeling to strike the flanks and rear of the Persian center that had, moments earlier, been winning its own portion of the battle. The Persian center, which had pushed successfully forward against weak resistance, suddenly found itself being attacked from 3 directions simultaneously by heavily armored Greek infantry it had believed it was defeating. This double envelopment collapsed Persian cohesion entirely. What had been an organized, disciplined invasion force fractured into a desperate retreat toward the ships waiting on the beach, with the pursuing Greek hoplites inflicting devastating casualties on soldiers now fighting without formation, without organized command, and increasingly without any coordinated way to defend themselves. The fighting reached its most brutal, chaotic phase at the water's edge, where the retreating Persian force attempted to reach the safety of their ships, while Greek hoplites pressed the attack directly onto the beach itself. Herodotus records specific, named casualties from this final phase that give some sense of how close and vicious the fighting actually became. Callimachus, the war archon whose tie-breaking vote had committed Athens to battle, was killed in the fighting near the ships. Herodotus also names Cynaegirus, brother of the Athenian playwright Aeschylus, himself present at the battle as a hoplite, a detail modern audiences frequently find surprising given how central Aeschylus became to Athenian dramatic tradition, as having been killed attempting to seize hold of a Persian ship's stern as it pulled away from shore, having his hand severed by an axe blow in the attempt, according to Herodotus's account. Despite the ferocity of the fighting at the ships, most of the Persian force did manage to successfully re-embark and escape by sea, though 7 Persian ships, according to Herodotus, were captured or destroyed in the process. The Athenian casualties, by contrast to the Persian losses, were remarkably light for engagement of this scale and consequence. Herodotus records exactly 192 Athenian dead, a figure ancient and modern historians alike have generally treated as reliable. Given that Herodotus notes the Athenians specifically commemorated their fallen by name on a memorial at the site, making an inflated or invented figure considerably less plausible than in cases involving vaguer, rounder ancient casualty claims. Persian losses, by contrast, were catastrophic by comparison. Herodotus gives a figure of 6,400 Persian dead, a number modern historians treat with somewhat more caution than the precise Athenian count, since large enemy casualty figures in ancient warfare were frequently subject to exaggeration for propaganda purposes. But even conservative modern estimates place Persian losses in the thousands, representing a genuinely lopsided tactical victory by any reasonable standard. Here's where the story most people actually know about Marathon diverges sharply from what the earliest and most reliable historical sources actually describe. And it's worth walking through exactly how that gap formed, because it tells you something important about how legends get built on top of real history. The popular version most Americans have heard goes something like this. After the battle, an exhausted soldier ran the full 26 miles from Marathon to Athens without stopping, burst into the city, gasped out the single word Nike, and immediately collapsed and died from the effort, giving his life to deliver the news. This is essentially the origin story for the modern marathon race distance, and it's a genuinely dramatic, moving piece of storytelling. The problem is that Herodotus, writing roughly 40 to 50 years after the battle, closer to the actual event than any other surviving source, and generally considered our most historically careful witness for this campaign, never mentions this run at all. What Herodotus does describe in detail is the run Phidippides made before the battle, the roughly 150-mile sprint to Sparta seeking reinforcements, completed in about 2 days. That's the documented, historically grounded athletic feat. The famous dying messenger story doesn't appear in surviving ancient sources until several centuries later, first showing up in the writings of Plutarch in the 1st century AD, and then, in a more fully developed dramatic form, in the work of the satirist Lucian in the 2nd century AD, both writing 500 to 600 years after the actual battle took place, drawing on sources and traditions that had accumulated, and almost certainly embellished, over those intervening centuries. Some modern historians suspect the later story may represent a conflation or dramatic elaboration of the earlier, genuinely documented Phidippides run to Sparta, transformed over generations of retelling into a shorter, more immediately dramatic post-battle sprint to Athens. This matters for reasons beyond simple historical accuracy. When the modern Olympic Games were revived in Athens in 1896, organizers specifically created a new long-distance running event, named the Marathon, explicitly inspired by the popular legend of the dying messenger. Cementing a several centuries later embellishment into permanent global athletic tradition, run by millions of people every year in a distance and a story that doesn't actually match what our earliest, most reliable ancient source tells us happened. None of this diminishes what actually occurred after the battle, which was, in its own right, a genuinely urgent and consequential piece of military logistics. After defeating the Persian force on the beach, the Athenian army, having just fought a brutal, exhausting battle, still faced a serious tactical problem. The surviving Persian fleet, rather than simply sailing home in defeat, turned south around Cape Sunion, apparently intending to sail directly for Athens itself while the city's defending army was still occupied at Marathon, hoping to seize the undefended city before the hoplites could return to protect it. Recognizing this threat, the Athenian army, remarkably, force-marched the full distance back to Athens on the same day, arriving in time to take up defensive positions before the Persian fleet reached the city. Confronted with an Athenian army already back in position and ready to defend the city, the Persian commanders apparently concluded that a landing and assault would no longer succeed with the element of surprise gone, and the fleet ultimately withdrew and sailed back toward Asia. This same-day forced march, covering the same roughly 26-mile distance immortalized in the later legend, arguably represents the more historically solid candidate for genuine physical endurance connected to the battle. Exhausted soldiers, having already fought and won a major engagement that morning, marching the full distance home to defend their city. It would be easy, given the eventual scale of the later Greco-Persian wars. Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea, fought a full decade later under Xerxes rather than Darius, to treat Marathon as a relatively minor prelude to the more famous conflicts that followed. That framing significantly understates what this particular battle actually accomplished and why ancient Greeks themselves treated it with such extraordinary reverence. Marathon was the first time a Greek force had defeated a major Persian army in direct land battle, shattering any assumption on either side that Persian military superiority was simply an inevitable, uncontestable fact. For a Greek world that had watched Persia absorb the wealthy, sophisticated Greek cities of Ionia with what had seemed like unstoppable momentum, Marathon proved, decisively and publicly, that disciplined, well-led Greek infantry could defeat Persia's numbers and organization on the right terrain, under the right tactical conditions. This mattered enormously for what came next. When Darius's son Xerxes launched Persia's far larger invasion of Greece a decade later, he faced a Greek world with genuine, battle-tested confidence that resistance was possible, a psychological and political foundation that historians consider a meaningful factor in Greece's ability to organize the kind of sustained, unified resistance that ultimately turned back that much larger invasion at Salamis and Plataea. Athens, in particular, emerged from Marathon with a new, hard-earned sense of civic and military confidence that fed directly into the following decades of Athenian political and cultural development. The same decades that would go on to produce Athenian, democracy's fullest expression, and much of the philosophical, dramatic, and artistic achievement the ancient world is still remembered for today. The battle also cemented Miltiades' reputation, though his subsequent career reflects the harsh, often unforgiving nature of Athenian politics. Within roughly a year of his greatest triumph, Miltiades led a failed military expedition against the island of Paros, was wounded in the attempt, returned to Athens facing serious political prosecution for the expedition's failure, and died shortly afterward from his wound, his reputation considerably diminished from its Marathon-era peak. It's a genuinely sobering coda to a career that, for one specific afternoon on a dusty coastal plain, changed the entire trajectory of Western history. The Battle of Marathon has survived in popular memory largely through a dramatic story about a dying runner that almost certainly never happened, at least not in the form most people know it. The real history is, in its own way, more impressive. A heavily outnumbered citizen militia, using clever, deliberately unconventional tactics under a general with unusually direct knowledge of his enemy, defeated a professional invasion force from the largest empire on Earth, and then, in the same exhausting day, marched the full distance home to defend their city from a second attack, without the benefit of a single legendary sprint to inspire them. That's not a lesser story than the myth. It's a better one, because it actually happened. If this gave you a clearer picture of what really occurred at Marathon, hit like, subscribe if you're not already, and let me know in the comments, did you already know the famous Marathon Run story wasn't in the earliest historical sources? And tell me which ancient battle you want broken down next.